Hello and a warm welcome to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. It is fair to say most in Russia deemed the year 2013 to be a successful one for the country. Alas, we are now in a new year. What does 2014 hold for Russia? To discuss this and more, my guests in London join me, Christopher Walker. He's a freelance journalist and former head of the Times Bureau in Moscow. We also have Laza Kekic. He is a Russia analyst at the Economist intelligence unit. And here in Moscow with me is Yaroslav Lissovolik. He's the chief economist at Deutsche Bank, Russia. Welcome, gentlemen. My favorite expert on the economy is sitting right next to me, Yaroslav. Let's take a look at the economy for 2014. And if I can preface my question, we saw in the middle of last year, the political elite, the Kremlin, changed gears from stimulus to what we could probably call in shorthand Russian austerity. The economy slowed down, almost flatlined by the end of the year. Okay, I'm going to go ... pick up 2014.
2014, the key issue is growth. How do we get it? Is there going to be some help coming from the global economy? That's probably one of the key factors that we're looking for, because our projections suggest that there is going to be this pickup and that will stimulate Russia's growth to some degree. But the key issue, I think, for the Russian authorities now increasingly is the understanding that there may be a pause in growth of sorts, and what is increasingly becoming important is the quality of growth. Putin is talking increasingly about the need for greater efficiency, about the need to drive growth more, not through superficial stimulus, various forms of quantitative easing, but rather through productivity improvements. And the word productivity is the key issue, I think, for this year.
Yaroslav, that sounds all very good. Will it be painful?
I think there will be costs. Productivity is something that is hard to come by. And obviously, in terms of fiscal spending, in terms of other factors, there will be a price that will have to be paid.
Christopher, in London, would you like to weigh in? Let's look at the economy here, because there's the expectation of lower oil prices. We have a Kremlin that seems to be much more concerned with reform, and as Yaroslav pointed out, better qualitative growth, not just quantitative growth. How do you see the economy in 2014?
Yeah, I think a lot will depend, as before, on that oil and gas price. There is at the moment an idea, as you say, that they'll be going down or levelling. But we know the Middle East, it's at the moment just in its most turbulent way. There could easily be changes there. And of course, it's to Putin's great advantage if the price of petrol oil was to go up again. Then he could almost lean back on his laurels and get on with reforming. So I think he's going to be looking, as it were, with his economic hat on, to the diplomatic hinterland, very much with the mind of how things not only will affect the diplomacy of the Kremlin, but will affect his own economy, because it really is very much dependent in that way on the world. It's not isolated anymore like it used to be.
It's very interesting. The 2008, 2009, I think the Kremlin learned their lesson in a very big way, that you have to be very careful of external shocks. Laza, if I can go to you now in London, one of the interesting things is that at the end of 2013, as we go into the new year 2014, this is the first time in this century for Russia that they've actually had to really seriously think about the growth issue, because we had it for so long and disposable incomes kept increasing, purchasing power continued to expand. It was a good 12, 13 years here, and now people are seeing a very different kind of economic environment. How do you take that?
Yes, you make a good point, and I guess that might be the only caveat I would introduce to your overall introduction about Russia having had a good 2013. Mr. Putin might have had personally a pretty solid 2013, but the Russian economy really surprised on the downside. If you look at everyone's predictions at the start of the year, both the international organization, commercial organization, I'm sure also Deutsche Banks were quite much lower than what actually transpired, and certainly the economists were. So what happened in 2013 in some ways can't even be totally easily explained, that the downturn in growth should have been so severe. And not many people expected that.
Well, I think one of the interesting things is I've talked to quite a few economists over the last 6 months here, and most of them will say the economic situation that the country found itself in at the end of the year was self-induced. This, again, going from an expansionary policy to much more austerity. I mean, this is a gamble, Yaroslav.
Well, I would agree with the fact that certainly Russia had the resources, the wherewithal to induce greater growth. There's 170, 180 billion in the two oil funds. There is certainly the capacity of the central bank to print more liquidity and to inject more liquidity into the financial sector. This hasn't really been done. And why hasn't it been done, as opposed to, say, the U.S., to Europe and other places? Partly the reason is precisely this focus on the change and the quality of growth, on attaining growth in a different way. I think there's the realization that using the old capacity, so to say, the old infrastructure, is already not the way to attain higher growth. Most of it has been employed, has been used up. So what really is at stake is, on the one hand, to try to provide the incentives for the labor force to be more productive, but at the same time also to have in place the infrastructure, the investment that would allow for different capacity, for different potential growth.
Quickly come in there. I mean, this is a key point in disappointment 2013. Basically, the collapse in investment. There was no growth. We don't have final figures yet, but given that there were a lot of projects that were meant to go underway, and certainly in terms of the commercial, the private sector, as I say, I think the final figures will show probably zero growth in investment, which is very disturbing when you're mentioning all these things like a need to infrastructure, productivity. You can't do any of that without investment.
Christopher, if I could go to you, you said something earlier that I think was very interesting about reform and resting on one's laurels. I think across the board, economists that I talked to here in Moscow, in a way, see a silver lining in the current economic situation, because no one wants, economists particularly, do not want any more resting on laurels, because this is what we've seen for a decade. And this having to have to roll up your sleeves now and really squeeze a little bit more productivity out of the economy, this is something that really the economy definitely needs.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think the phrase about quality growth, not so much just splashing in the figures, but making sure it goes, if possible, into the proper places. And of course, all the time looking over the shoulder for possible dangers of inflation when growth is being looked into. The fact, of course, there's a new boss of the Bank of Russia, the central bank. We don't know quite whether she's going to make any effect or not with her attitudes, or whether she'll be passed over. But most of all, economists, they can't resist. They're a mean lot, really. A bit of austerity never did anybody any harm. I'd hate to see their Christmas cards.
You're obviously a fan of George Osborne.
Okay, gentlemen. Laza, if I can go back to you. You mentioned Mr. Putin. Mr. Putin had a very good year by almost any definition in 2013. Let's take a look at 2014. Is he going to, if I can use this phrase, continue his winning streak?
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. He's certainly on a roll. He had some incredible successes. If we look at Syria, even Ukraine, Snowden, the whistleblower, he sort of seems to have got the better of President Obama. Now, whether he can continue that, I guess that's not totally easy to answer, because it'll depend on events. If we look at one particular, which I would maybe emphasize as a caveat, which Ukraine overall seems like a success, but that might be a bit of a poison chalice, and that is something that could still boomerang back.
I'm glad you're saying that, because I don't think it's necessarily a success. Essentially, this is something that has happened inside of Ukraine. Western media likes to make it into a binary, but Yaroslav, let's take a look at the political environment here. How many presidents can you think of, world leaders, after being in power for 13 years, and he's at the top of his game?
Absolutely. And, he clearly has benefited from the consumer boom that he oversaw during the first two terms. But that reserve and the contrast effect with the 1990s is starting to dwindle. And you need new drivers. And I think his ability to sustain his popularity is partly based precisely on the capability to come up with new things, new drivers consistently. And both on the economic and on the political front. I mean, when you have greater difficulty, say, with the economic drivers, last year it was foreign policy that really delivered, I think, to a significant degree.
You're listening to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Christopher, let's stay with the Putin topic here. A very interesting comment that we just heard from Yaroslav, because it's quite fair to say, if I can say in a nutshell, there is a social contract here. Leaders are put in power, are trusted to do the right thing, and we have On foreign policy front, I think it's extremely complicated. Does it make Putin a grand master at diplomacy, or just as Obama and his Western friends are just complete idiots and just stumble all the time, which I think you can make a very strong argument for. What are Mr. Putin's fortunes for this year?
Well, I agree. I think it could be a better year even than 2013. It has the potential, of course, starting off with these games in Sochi that could really launch the year. February the 7th, wow, is it going to be a great success? Or is, as one BBC Christmas commentator said, that Mr. Putin might slip on the ice and break his leg? I think that's unlikely. But in general,
it's very interesting, Chris. You really hit the nail on the head here, because that's exactly what Western media wants to have happen here. I think it's very, very tragic.
No, I don't think that's fair, actually. No, I don't think that's fair.
Yeah.
I think they, frankly, feel that Obama has been out-tricked, if we took a football metaphor, by a cleverer player at the top of his game, as you said. Obama looks like an old lag. We'll sort of send him off to the second division. He just doesn't seem to raise his head above his failed medical program. And on Syria, you never thought really that anybody could show a magical touch on Syria. Its poison chalice isn't in it. It's about a 6-gallon chalice. But Putin somehow has managed, I see it again in football terms, weaving. I see him like the late lamented George Best, the famous winger from Northern Ireland. He's getting everything right somehow, but it's risky.
No, I would agree that there's caveats here and there's risks ahead. Yeah. First of all, we were, coming back to the economy. If the stagnation continues or if income stops dropping, then it's sort of anyone's bet. I think on the positive side, Putin was probably wise to try and diffuse some potential tensions with these amnesties, finally getting the Pussy Riot issue off the agenda, which, frankly, is an embarrassment. And, of course, letting Khodorkovsky go about a year ahead of schedule. So I think all that sort of eases things a bit. But I think the dangers are, of course, on foreign policy. We don't know, again, coming back, what exactly will happen. And again, it's, the old Clinton adage, it's the economy, stupid. If the economy continues underperforming, then I think it's hard to predict that or maintain that Putin's popularity will continue to be high. And remember that the trend in the Putin popularity has been on a gradual, not a drastic, but a gradual downward curve. It's not where it was a while ago.
Yeah, but after 13 years, I think the last count is 61%. I mean,
even more.
Yes,
they'd kill for that. You're right, but we're comparative terms what it was before and the trend now. So if he can maintain that, sure. And he's benefiting. Is it you who also said that pretty ineffectual and somewhat weak opposition? So he's been benefiting from that.
Yaroslav, we've talked many times over the years about the BRIC countries and a multipolar world. Do you think this is a trend that is sustainable here? Russia is looking at new partners around the world. This is something that people are getting used to now. Where does it go from here?
Well, I think we've seen some interesting twists in this whole debate. Initially, after 2008, 2009, the BRICS was really in vogue. Everybody was talking about this as the next paradigm, so to say, of global growth. But more recently, in the past several years, there seems to be a bit more unease about the future of the BRICS, given the fact that some of them, like Brazil, like India, to some degree China, have exhibited some deceleration. But I think this is still the future, in my view. I think that these countries have enormous potential. We're seeing more active measures on their part to coordinate their activities, to integrate in various ways, including through the creation of unified bank that would, with time, perhaps compete even with the likes of the World Bank. We're seeing a global vision that is starting to emerge there. And I think this is the competitor to Western countries that is evolving, that is emerging. And even if you look at the economic dynamics, say last year, everybody in the beginning of the year was saying China would grow significantly less than 7%. And again, China surprised on the upside, significantly above 7.5% for the year. And perhaps next year even more than 8%, this year even more than 8%. So in my view, this is the future.
Chris, you mentioned Sochi. I'd like to go back to it. I work in media and I'm a keen observer how Western media observes Russia. Do you think that Russia will get a different chance on the back of the Sochi Games? I mean, people actually come here and see what it's like instead of just talking about it in their armchair in London or New York?
One would hope they would. I hope the gay issue doesn't play big in the media, because frankly, I see it as a bit of a sidebar myself. I think to an extent, what will really show is the organisation. You know, the London Olympics was eventually incredibly well organised, and there weren't any of the usual cock-ups that we've had. And if Russia really can show that it can get everything built, it's done a superb and huge job in getting Sochi ready for the Winter Olympics. So it just inevitably becomes a showcase because Mr. Putin himself, by these amnesties, has made that an issue. People are going to, of course, say, is that a one-off PR stunt for the Games? Or is there perhaps a little bit more deeper change in attitude?
Again,
hold it, Christopher. I'm really glad you brought that up because I will give you my opinion after living here for 15 years is that Vladimir Putin really doesn't give a hoot what world opinion thinks about him. He cares about one thing. He cares about how the Russian people think about him.
I
That's
totally
his
agree
bottom
with
line.
that. Yeah.
No, because this is one of the interesting things that if you look at Mr. Gorbachev and you look at Mr. Yeltsin, they played to the West. They played to Western media. They wanted to be darlings. And, they did things for the West to get there, those acolytes. And this is the difference in 2000. 2000, when Mr. Putin was elected president, he doesn't give a hoot about it. And so the amnesty thing, this was on the anniversary of the Constitution. I called it in an op-ed, taking out the trash. But that's my own humble opinion. So, Laza, you can jump in.
Nice objective
Laza.
remark there.
yeah, I'm not sure I'd use that exact.
I wouldn't want a night at a dance with you and the Pussy Riot.
But I think, looking at 2014 and Sochi, a lot of it really, again, depends, how things would go in terms of especially security. I think these sort of recent tragic terrorist incidents, bombings, have been a reminder how fragile things are. And, Putin's sort of Russia's reputation, in a way, is on the line. The disruptions don't actually have to be in Sochi themselves. I mean, to have picked Volgograd, the old Stalingrad, the symbol
I
of
shouldn't be, no, they won't
Russian
be
resistance,
Sochi,
I think was quite a shock, these two recent bombings. And if you have anything like that during the Games itself, I think that would be quite a setback and an embarrassment for Mr. Putin. So, it's very hard to predict. I mean, everything's been done to try and enhance security, including these latest measures. But with these things, obviously, you can never be too sure.
It's very interesting, Yaroslav, if we look at the Sochi Games, looking at the coverage of those horrific bombings in Volgograd, and I agree with our two other guests here, is that this is something that could really put a negative spin on the Olympic Games. But on the other hand, when you beef up security, it's a double whammy. Oh, look, it's a police state. See, it's almost kind of like a no-win situation. And I see this being spun in media.
I see this being discussed a lot in the media here in Russia and abroad. And I think really what you want to see is actually a lot of security. Yes, you need that security to ensure that the games go in a safe way. And I'm sure my personal view is that this should be a significant boost to the economy, to Russia's image. We are looking at the Olympic factor as one of the potential drivers for growth this year, especially on the consumer side. So first quarter, there are some concerns amongst economists that growth will not be as good, partly because of some of the unease in the banking sector, because of what the central bank is doing with the consolidation of the banking sector. But our view is that this Olympic factor may actually pose an upside surprise to growth dynamics, especially on the household consumption side. And furthermore, if you look at next year, I think we're looking potentially at significantly lower inflation, perhaps the lowest that we've seen throughout the past 10 years. We're projecting less than 5% inflation for this year. And that in itself, bringing down interest rates to some degree, boosting growth, perhaps also on the investment side, should be a positive factor in my view.
You're listening to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. We're talking about Russia's prospects for 2014. Okay, Christopher, let's look at domestic politics here. Over the last year and a half, almost 2 years now, since Putin has returned to the presidency for his third term, there's been a lot of focus on Russia's political opposition. There's not much talk about it right now because there's not much going on. How do you see their prospects for 2014?
Not very good. Frankly, if they were a stock, I wouldn't back them on the stock market. Because, as you say, we haven't heard anything about them much. An opposition you don't hear about is a dead duck. We haven't heard about them because they're all locked up. We've not heard about them because...
who's
they
locked
haven't...
up? Okay,
No.
come on. That's
I
that's
said
such a
we
gross
haven't.
generalization.
No, I said
that's a gross
sorry.
generalization.
No, I said that's why we haven't heard about them because they're not effective.
Okay,
No,
well,
that's
that's a
one
different
way to
statement.
keep. I
That's
don't mean that in the way of saying Russia locks them up. I'm saying an opposition that can't make itself heard in a situation where it could operate is not very strong. You asked what I thought its prospects were for the 2014. My view is its prospects are not great. Frankly, nobody in the West, doesn't matter their view on Putin, can see any other leader for Russia. And they admire what he's done. We haven't mentioned Iran yet, which could be a big diplomatic triumph.
Like I said, there's a lot to cover here, but I want to cover domestic politics here. Laza, if I can go to you, why people don't hear much about them, because I don't think they have much interesting to say. I made it a point over the last 2 years to go to almost every single major demonstration in Moscow. And some of them were, I would say, even use the word, significant. However, if you walk through the crowd, you can go through the entire spectrum. You can go from ecologists to Stalinists to socialists to neo-Nazis, other nationalists, and more and more. And this is what the opposition is to Vladimir Putin. This is the problem for the opposition. I mean, the Western media likes to focus on what Putin does, but what about the opposition and their message? What is it?
Well, it's so diverse, and in some ways that's the problem, lack of any unifying message or even unifying movement. On the other hand, just to keep in mind, most people were taken how things can just happen even when unexpected. When these demonstrations first broke out, limited to Moscow and St. Petersburg and the so-called middle classes, but still, I think if you recall, when they started, very few people expected this to happen. Everybody was emphasizing how the Russians, even the middle class, were totally apathetic. All they were interested was freedom of travel and so on. And people weren't expecting them to come out on the streets because of allegedly false Duma election. So given that it happened once, I wouldn't totally exclude that there might be some catalyst, again, most particularly a failing economy. Sorry?
It's very interesting you point that out because, as I walked through those crowds, I came across the same people that have never liked Vladimir Putin. Socialists, nationalists. These people have never liked him.
But the ones you mentioned have always cut deals with him. They've always cut deals with him, the people that you mentioned.
Well, we already talked about the social contract here. Yaroslav, one of the interesting things I find, you were born and bred here, well-educated in the West, I have to say. I have seen, and we've just heard the term middle class, I've seen the middle class here evolve almost beyond recognition. What kind of middle class do we have in 2014?
Well, I think this is a middle class that has been throughout the crisis, throughout the past several years, that continue to be supported by the state from the budget in terms of higher social outlays. The one big issue, I think, that needs to be resolved is the bureaucratic overhang and red tape that is constraining small and medium-sized businesses in the country. I think this is the biggest structural reform that we need for this year in order to unlock the potential for the middle class to contribute to a greater degree to growth. But other than that, I think Putin has been the creator to some degree of the middle class, and the one who, under whose presidency, you essentially saw a significant expansion in the ranks of the middle class. And, there may be some positives in what we've seen recently, including Russia's doing business survey ranking that has improved significantly. Perhaps with time, some of this progress will feed into better dynamic with regard to the middle class and with regard to the micro level growth that we're hoping to see from the private sector.
Christopher, what have we not mentioned? We heard Iran, Russia could play a major role in that diplomatic initiative coming out of Tehran and maybe being embraced, probably unlikely embraced in Washington. Russia's playing an important role in making sure that Iran gets a fair deal.
Yes, it's incredibly important. It's another place where Russia is suddenly seems to be sharing a similar ideal, aim with the US, especially over terrorism too. If there is a big attack in Sochi, you can be sure that Mr. Obama will be very sympathetic, as it was somebody from Dagestan who attacked his own marathon, not games in Boston. And I think beyond one thing, very quickly, we haven't got time for it. We could have another hour. Is we've concentrated on Europe and the Middle East, the Far East, and there is a looming problem between Japan and China. Now, I don't know whether magician Putin can do anything to cool that down. I rather doubt he can. But at least it's something he's going to be very conscious of. He's very well informed with what's going on there. And it's not a joke that some papers are even...
Absolutely. It's not a joke. Laza, that's a very good point, because I've been studying Vladimir Putin's presidency from the very beginning, even when he was prime minister the first time. And he likes to be put into a situation where he has options. He always likes to have his options. This is why Mr. Snowden was so vexing to everyone, because he had very limited options. And that was the first time in his presidency where I saw him really grapple with the lack of options. But as Christopher pointed out here, we have a situation brewing in the Pacific where Russia may not have a lot of options, just hoping to stay out of it.
Well, I think that's right. Putin can't, Russia can't, there's obviously, it's not the player the Soviet Union once was geopolitically and globally. So I wouldn't exaggerate their ability to intercede in the Japan-China. But still, if we look at the situation overall, and especially domestically, again, to reiterate, he does at the moment seem to be quite strong domestically, if not because of, lack of alternatives, lack of opposition. So I think he'll continue to be top dog for some time from that point of view. But we can't expect him, to achieve success in every situation. And just finally, I think Christopher was right to bring up Iran. That could be another. Basically, if we look at it from the point of view of U.S.-Russia, it's a win-win. I wouldn't sort of actually exaggerate the extent to which, it's been claimed Obama's been outplayed or something. Obama's actually benefited quite a bit from some of Putin's action. Again, Syria was a win situation for Obama, not, I think, as it's usually portrayed as some sign of weakness.
And similarly
I
agree with you.
Iran also.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
I agree with you, because I've been asked over and over again in the last few months about this. And I tend to look at Putin actually saved Obama, gave him a way out, because this was not a conflict that he really wanted to go into. And this shows the weaknesses of American foreign policy with its allies, because its allies, Israel and Saudi Arabia, were so keen on that attack. And remarkably, and I am a cynic to the core, the American people in the British Parliament, they stood up and said no, which I think is a very interesting event for 2013, something I never would have imagined. You're agreeing with me here, Yaroslav.
Yeah, and I think if we're talking about the Pacific, we should never exclude the possibility that Russia will be increasingly a very active player in the region. And we're seeing that Russia is reorienting a lot of its activity, including economic activity, towards the east, towards the Pacific. And I think one of the revelations that we may see is that diplomatically, economically, Russia will be playing an increasingly important role in the region.
Do you think they fear China? What's your opinion? Do you think they fear China, the Russians?
Well, I think Russia will be playing a very complicated game there, because on the one hand, this is a huge player, China, but on the other hand, this is also a potential ally in terms of, these alliances in the East. And Russia, I think, will be far more subtle and far less ideological, far more pragmatic in the way it structures its alliances going forward.
All right, on that very optimistic note, hopefully this is the way 2014 will play out. Thank you very much, Christopher, Laza, and Yaroslav here sitting with me in Voice of Russia's Moscow studio. You've been listening to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Stay with VOR.